Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 1. Dorothea and Celia were the nieces of Mr. Brooke. They were living with their kind old bachelor uncle. Dorothea and her sister Celia were well-connected, sensible ladies from a good family. Their parents had died many years before, and they were raised in the upper-class Brooke household in Tipton, at their uncle's country house. The year was 1826, and there was a well-bred economy in England, especially in Brooke's Grange. The girls then believed in economy of dress, and Dorothy's beauty seemed to be increased by her poor dress. But her hands and wrists were finely formed. They didn't mind their economic situation. With her beauty, Miss Brooke was receiving good offers of marriage, but she had aspirations in the world of academics. Her strong opinions made many cautious men stop to think of a marriage with her. It wasn't an easy decision for these men. Unlike her elder sister, Celia had fewer aspirations in the world of academics and religion. She was innocent-looking, and the country people liked her more. Dorothea was more careful with her money, like her uncle. She was also an unusual young lady with her big eyes. In those years, women were expected to have weak opinions and domestic characteristics. Cooking, cleaning, and raising children were good characteristics of a woman. One day, the two ladies were talking, looking at a jewelry box. "Dorothea, let's look in it. It once belonged to my mother. We can choose and divide it between us." At first, Dorothea didn't want to, but then she said, "Okay, Celia, let's open the box. It's been so many months since Uncle gave it to us." The finest among them was a necklace of purple amethysts, set in exquisite gold work. Dorothea immediately took the necklace and fastened it around Celia's neck. "Wear this necklace with your new dress, but I won't take any of them." Celia suddenly replied, "If you don't take any, I won't put on this precious necklace. You're the older sister, and you should take what you like." "No, no, dear, no," said Dorothea. "Yes, you must take some. You may like to keep it for Mamma's sake." "No, I've got other things of Mamma. I have her wooden box and much more, so we don't need to discuss this any longer," cried Dorothea. "If you don't take any of them, I won't wear that necklace," insisted Celia, but she added, "This necklace would be a little tight for your neck. Something else like a ring would suit you better." The unfitness of the necklace for Dorothea had made Celia happier in taking it, but now her elder sister had to take something precious, and Celia insisted on it. She opened some ring boxes, and they saw a magnificent ring which had emeralds and diamonds on it. "How beautiful these gems are," said Dorothea. "It's strange how deep the colors seem. They seem like fragments of heaven. I think that emerald is more beautiful than any of them." "And there is a bracelet to match it," said Celia. "What do you think?" "They are really lovely. Yes, I will keep these, the ring and the bracelet." Celia thought that her sister showed some weakness. Finally, Dorothea took the emerald ring and the bracelet from the box, and they returned to some work they were doing. Dorothea was not like Celia. She was open and ardent. She liked reading serious books at night, riding on a horse, and learning more about how to improve the cottages on her uncle's land. Her serious interests made the country people afraid, because they were too unusual for them. Although one day she would be left some money by her rich uncle, most of the men in the village would hesitate before they made her an offer. But Sir James Chetham did not have this kind of hesitation about Dorothea. Sir Chetham was living close to the Brooke family in their country. He was a red-haired, handsome man. He often visited the Grange, and was interested in Dorothea. But this young lady believed he was more inclined toward her sister. She was also thinking that he would be a good husband for Celia. Dorothea was always the same. When a man visitor came into the Grange, she always thought that the aim of the visitor was to see her uncle or her sister, nothing more. One night, Sir James Chetham came to have dinner with the Brooke family, but he was not alone. He brought another man with him. This man was the Reverend Edward Casaubon, a 50-year-old gray-haired priest, known as a man of deep learning in the neighborhood. Dorothea felt a little more anxious than usual. Mr. Casaubon's manner was serious. Soon Dorothea started to admire his deep-set eyes and his endless knowledge. Mr. Brooke, Sir Chetham, Mr. Casaubon, and the ladies were talking at dinner. Suddenly, Sir Chetham started to speak. "I am reading the agricultural chemistry," said Chetham. "The reason is that I'm going to take one of the farms into my own hands. Do you appreciate that, Miss Brooke?" Her uncle answered before Dorothea could give an answer. "Oh, in my opinion, it's a great mistake, Sir Chetham. That kind of farming costs a lot. And it's a mistake to bring electricity to your land and try to improve your cowhouse. I went into science a great deal myself at one time, but I saw it would not do. You can let nothing alone. You may as well keep a pack of dogs. It would cost less." "Surely," said Dorothea, "it's better to spend money in finding out how men can make the most of the land which supports them all. It's acceptable to make yourself poor in performing experiments for the good of all." She spoke with more energy than was expected of such a young lady. But Sir Chetham had asked her opinion, and she had answered. Mr. Casaubon turned his eyes markedly on Dorothy while she was speaking. Dorothea thought that she could force Sir Chetham to do many good things if he was to be her brother-in-law. Mr. Brooke said to Mr. Casaubon in his easy, smiling way, "Young ladies don't understand political economy, you know. Human reason may carry a bit too far. It carried me a good way one time, but I saw it would not do. I have always defended a little theory. We must have thought, else we'd be back in the Dark Ages." He continued asking, "Talking of books, do you like to read new novels, Mr. Casaubon?" "No," said Mr. Casaubon. "I don't have leisure time for such literature now. I've just been using up my eyesight on old characters lately, but I want a reader for my evenings. I can say that I don't like easily the readers' voices. I cannot stand an imperfect reader." This was the first time that Mr. Casaubon had spoken more than a few words. Dorothea said to herself that this old man was the most interesting man she had ever seen. She felt something strange in her heart. She noticed that it was beating fast while he was speaking to the others. Later, Sir Chetham said to Dorothea, "You are fond of riding, Miss Brooke. I wish you would let me send over a chestnut horse for you to try. It has been trained for a lady." "Thank you. You are so kind. But I mean to give up riding," replied Dorothea. "I shall not ride any more." "No, that is too hard," said Sir James, turning to Celia, who sat at his right hand. "I saw you on Saturday, and you are riding very well, Miss Brooke. I think you'd better enjoy the pleasures of hunting." Celia blushed above her neckline, and feeling afraid to say something that would not please her sister, simply said, "She likes giving up." Mr. Casaubon was watching Dorothea all night long, and he had noticed this. "There may be good reasons for choosing not to do what is very agreeable," replied Dorothea. Finally, Sir James said his last words about the subject. "Exactly. You give up from some high, generous motive." "No, not exactly. I did not say that of myself. Don't misunderstand me," replied Dorothea, blushing. Celia and Mr. Brooke knew that she rarely blushed, only from high delight or anger. This time she was really angry with Sir James. "I began a long time ago to collect documents," said Mr. Brooke, "and they need arranging." Dorothea couldn't control herself and said, "I wish you would let me arrange them for you, uncle. I would give them letters and then make a list of subjects under each letter." Everyone in the room was surprised by her words, but only Mr. Casaubon smiled approval and supported her with his words. "You have a perfect secretary at hand. This is a great chance for you, Mr. Brooke." "No, no," replied Mr. Brooke. "I cannot let young ladies arrange my documents. I don't want them to get lost." Shaking his head, he did not accept this offer. Dorothea felt hurt, and she was also disappointed. Later, when the two girls were alone in the drawing-room, suddenly Celia said, "How ugly Mr. Casaubon is!" But Dorothea replied, "Celia, don't talk like that. He is one of the most different men I have ever seen." Celia thought privately, "Dorothea dislikes Sir Chetham, but I believe she wouldn't accept him as her husband." When Miss Brooke was at the tea-table, Sir James came to sit down by her and said, "I hope that you've changed your mind about giving up riding. As you know, riding is the most healthy of exercises." Dorothea responded coldly, "I think it would do Celia good if she would take to it." "But you are such an excellent horsewoman," insisted Sir James. "I have very little practice, and I don't want to try more," replied Dorothea. "Then you have to make much more practice, beautiful lady. Every lady has to be a perfect horsewoman, so she can accompany her husband." Dorothea seemed quite angry, and said, blushing, "Oh, you see how different we actually are. I won't be a perfect horsewoman, and it's so irrational to train myself only to be your riding partner." Mr. Casaubon came with a teacup in his hand. He was listening to them. "We mustn't look too deeply into motives," he said. Dorothea began to admire the speaker more as she was colored with pleasure. She thought that the gray-haired priest was a man who could understand her inner thoughts. She looked gratefully to him. Sir James thought that she wouldn't care for an offer of marriage from a dried-up priest towards 50, whose life was based on books, so he didn't feel any jealousy. He thought, away from her sister, Celia was talking quite easily. He said to himself that the second Miss Brooke was very agreeable as well as pretty, more clever and sensible than the elder sister. Chapter 2. The next day, Mr. Casaubon left the Grange. The reasons that might persuade Dorothea to accept him as a suitable husband budded and bloomed by the evening of the next day. Before he drove back to his large country house at Lowick, less than 10 kilometers from where the Brookes lived, he had taken a pleasant walk with Dorothea in the garden. He had mentioned to her the disadvantages of a lonely life. So Dorothea started to think that Mr. Casaubon might wish to marry her. "He thinks of me," she said to herself. She walked through the big garden thinking of this possible marriage. She admired his vast studies and knowledge. She understood that Casaubon had some regard for her. Although he was not able to show emotion, Dorothea felt honored. She thought that she could help him in his work. "I should learn everything so that I might help him in his great work," she said to herself. "I should learn everything. It would be my duty to study, and then I should know what to do when I get older. Everything seems like going on a mission to the people whose language I don't know. I hope I live in Lowick as soon as I can." But her thoughts were interrupted by Sir James. "It's so nice to see you, Miss Brooke," he said, raising his hat slowly. He thought he had never seen her looking so beautiful. He had brought a little dog to Dorothea as a present. The white puppy was moving under his arm, but Dorothea said coldly, I like to think that the animals have souls like our own. The life of a rat must be more interesting. But I believe all the petting that is given them does not make them happy. They have to be free to decide as a human being would. I think Celia likes these pets. She had a tiny terrier once, which she was very fond of. You can give it to her. You have your own opinion about everything, Miss Brooke, and it is always a good opinion, replied Sir James, trying to compliment her. But then he only said that he had heard of Dorothea's plan for building new and better cottages. He promised to help her whenever she asked for it. She proposed to build a couple of cottages and transfer 2 families from their old cabins, which could then be pulled down. The new ones could be built on the old sites. Sir James said, "Exactly." Later, when the 2 sisters were together, Celia said to her elder sister, "Sir James seems determined to do everything you wish." "He is a good and honored man, and more sensible than anyone would imagine," said Dorothea. "You mean that he appears silly," replied Celia, but Dorothea's answer was surprising. No, but he does not talk equally well on all subjects. But one tells the quality of their minds when they try to talk well." "You mean that Sir James tries and fails?" "I was speaking generally, and it's not the object of his life to please me." "Dorothea, can you really believe that?" "Absolutely. He thinks of me as a future sister, that's all." Celia blushed, and she said at once, "Do not make that mistake any longer, Dodo. People know that he's very much in love with you, and they are saying that he is going to marry you." "I'm sorry for Sir James," said Dorothy angrily. "How could he expect me to marry him?" Something suddenly encouraged Celia, and she said, "Well, I'm sorry for Sir James. I thought it right to tell you, because you went on as you always do, never looking just where you are, and walking in the wrong place. You always see what nobody else sees. It is impossible to satisfy you, yet you never see what is quite plain. That's your way, Dorothea." Their uncle met the 2 sisters in the hall, and he told Dorothea that he had been to Lowick for lunch, and Mr. Casaubon had sent some books for her. They were in the library. So Dorothea went directly to the library to read the books. They were about the Erie Church. Mr. Brooke sat down in his armchair, and he told her that Mr. Casaubon wanted to marry her. "It would be a great honor to anyone to be his companion," she said, with a great energy. "You like him, eh?" said Mr. Brooke, without showing any emotion or surprise. Dorothea could not speak. "I've promised to speak to you, but I also told him that there wasn't much chance. I said, 'My niece is very young.' He asked my permission to make you an offer of marriage, and I thought it better to tell you, my dear," said her uncle. Though Dorothea listened, she didn't seem to absorb all the important things he said. "Thank you, uncle," she said in a clear tone. "If he makes me an offer, I shall accept him. I admire and honor him more than any man I have ever seen." Mr. Brooke paused a little, and then he said in a low tone, "Well, he is a good match in some respects, but now Chatham is a good match, and our land lies together. I shall never interfere against your wishes, my dear. People should have their own way in marriage and that sort of thing, up to a certain point, you know. I have good reason to believe that Chatham wishes to marry you." His niece responded to him in a kind way. "It is impossible that I should ever marry Sir James Chatham. Please don't mention him in that light again, uncle." "But don't hurry, my dear," he replied. "You know that he's about 27 years older than you. His income is good. Still, he is not young, and I think his health is not over-strong." When Dorothea said, "I wish to have a husband who is above me in judgment and knowledge," there was nothing more left for Mr. Brooke to say. He could just say, "You've quite made up your mind, I see," and he gave the letter to Dorothea which was written by Mr. Casaubon. It was a long letter, and in it he asked her to marry him. This is a little part of Mr. Casaubon's letter. My dear Miss Brooke, I have your uncle's permission to write you on a subject which I can no longer keep in my heart. In the first hour of meeting you, I had an impression that you had been fit to be my wife. Our conversations showed me that we have so many things in common. I want to share my life with you. This is the accurate statement of my feelings. I know that you are much younger than I, but to be accepted by you as your husband will be the most important gift for me. So I am looking forward to having your reply and to read the expression of your sentiments with anxiety. Edward Casaubon. Dorothea trembled while she read the letter. Then she fell on her knees and cried. She was touched by it, and she immediately wrote out an acceptance. She wrote it 3 times until she could decide which the best answer was. She also didn't want him to think that her handwriting was bad. She wrote, My dear Mr. Casaubon, I am very grateful to you for loving me and thinking of me as your wife. There cannot be such a happiness for me in the world. I am looking forward to being your wife. If I write more, I can only repeat your words, as they also express my feelings. Yours devotedly, Dorothea Brooke. A few days later, Mr. Casaubon paid a morning visit, and he was invited again for the following week to dine and stay the night. He was really happy with Dorothea's reply about the marriage. Dorothea had 3 more conversations with him, and she was convinced that her first impression had been right. He had everything that she had imagined of a husband. He talked of what he was interested in, or else he was silent. To Dorothea, this was adorable. But he did not care about building cottages. After his 3rd visit, Dorothea thought that she should not force him to talk about this subject. Celia had no idea what had happened until Casaubon joined them all for dinner. After dinner, Celia, with an unusual tone, asked her sister about Mr. Casaubon. Why, he only came for dinner? Why not, Celia? I don't like to hear him eat his soup so. Don't make observations of that kind. Why not? They are quite true, said Celia, though she was beginning to be a little afraid. Many things are true which only the commonest minds observe. But the commonest minds can be useful. I think Mr. Casaubon's mother would have raised him better. Celia was really frightened after saying these words to Dorothea, and she was also ready to run away. It is right to tell you, Celia, that I am engaged to marry him, said Dorothea. Celia had never turned so pale before. She could only say, Oh, Dodo, I hope you will be happy. Is it quite decided then? Does Uncle know? Dorothea was hurt, but she said, I have accepted Mr. Casaubon's offer. My uncle brought me the letter he had written to me. I beg your pardon if I have said anything to hurt you, Dodo, said Celia. Never mind, Celia. We should never admire the same people. Of course, all the world round Tipton would not show sympathy to this marriage. Dorothea knew this, but Celia, at least, knew that her sister had made a serious mistake, and perhaps could be swayed from it. Chapter 3. Mr. Casaubon had spent a great deal of time at the Grange with Mr. Brooke and his 2 nieces. The marriage should take place in 6 weeks. Everything was arranged. The priest's house at Lowick was ready. Mr. Casaubon spent so much time at the Grange that this held back the improvement of his great work, titled The Key to All Legend. Dorothea wanted him to teach her Greek and Latin in order to help him. Sir James Chetham was surprised by the events. He was thinking that her uncle should not have allowed the marriage. He thought that Dorothea was too young to marry with Mr. Casaubon, and at least her friends ought to stop her doing anything foolish. But Sir James, in spite of Dorothea's engagement, began to like visiting the Grange, her home, once again. He was stung by her rejection, and could not understand her attraction to Casaubon at all. On a grey November morning, Dorothea went to see her future home at Lowick with her uncle and her sister Celia. The house was rather big, but not particularly cheery. The building was not ugly, but its small windows were depressing. "I'm sure Freshitt Hall, where Sir James lives, would have been pleasanter than this," said Celia to herself. She thought of the terrace full of flowers, the white freestone, and Sir James smiling above them like a prince. But Dorothea, on the contrary, found the house and the grounds all that she could wish. The carpets and the curtains with colors subdued by time, the dark bookshelves in the long library, the curious old maps on the walls of the corridor had no oppression for her, and seemed more cheerful than the casts in the pictures at the Grange. "Now, my dear Dorothy, I wish you to favor me by pointing out which room you would like to have as your sitting room," said Mr. Casaubon. "It is very kind of you to think of that, but I shall be much happier to take everything as it is, just as you have been used to having it." "Oh, Dodo," said Celia, "will you not have the bow-windowed room upstairs?" Mr. Casaubon led them upstairs, and they entered the room. The furniture was all of a faded blue, and there were miniatures of ladies and gentlemen. "Yes," said Mr. Brooke, "this would be a nice room with some new sofas. It's a little bare now." "No, uncle," said Dorothea. "Do not speak of changing anything. And you like them as they are, don't you?" she added, looking at Mr. Casaubon. Looking at the pictures on the wall, Dorothea asked him, "This is your mother, isn't it?" "Yes," he replied. "It's my mother's portrait, and the other is her elder sister." Looking closely at the portrait of the elder sister, Dorothea said, "She has an unusual face, those deep gray eyes, an irregular nose, and powdered curls hanging backward. It seems to me unusual rather than pretty. There's not a family likeness between her and your mother." Dorothea wanted to ask more, but she felt that it would not be suitable. Mr. Casaubon said, "My aunt made an unfortunate marriage, and I never saw her." Then he never spoke more about his aunt. After a little while, they went to look at the village. Dorothea was surprised with the cottages there, which were in good order. She thought that there would be nothing for her to do. As they continued their walk, the road led them to a tree, under which was a man sitting on a seat, busy with drawing a picture. Mr. Brooke asked Mr. Casaubon who that young man was. "He is a young relative of mine, a second cousin," he said, looking at Dorothea. "He is the grandson of my Aunt Julia." The young man put down his sketch-book and rose. He had bushy, light brown curls, and he was a handsome young man. "Dorothea, let me introduce you to my cousin, Mr. Will Ladislaw. Will, this is Miss Brooke." When the cousin lifted his hat, Dorothea could see a pair of gray eyes, a delicate, irregular nose, and hair falling backwards. Young Ladislaw did not feel it necessary to smile. "You are an artist, I see," said Mr. Brooke, taking up the sketchbook and turning it over. "No, I only draw a little," said Ladislaw, coloring, perhaps with temper more than modesty. "I'm afraid I'm no judge of these things, though I'd like to be. I've never seen the beauty of those pictures which you say are much praised, uncle," said Dorothea. Before they parted, Mr. Brooke invited young Ladislaw to the Grange to see his Italian drawings. "I did a little in this way myself at one time. You will come to my house, I hope, and I will show you what I did in this way," said Mr. Brooke to the young artist. Ladislaw accepted his invitation, but he disliked Dorothea immediately, because she was marrying his sour, humorless cousin, and because of the way she spoke poorly of herself. After they parted, Mr. Casaubon told them that Ladislaw was without occupation. "What is your nephew going to do with himself, Casaubon?" said Mr. Brooke. "My cousin, not my nephew." "Yes, your cousin. What will he do in the way of a career?" repeated Mr. Brooke. So Mr. Casaubon began to tell his cousin's story. Ladislaw had studied on the continent, and he wanted to go away again. He said that he hadn't chosen a profession yet, so he was supplying his second cousin for a year or so. But he and his cousin did not seem to get along at all. He had a view of life and work completely opposed to Casaubon's, and was much more impulsive and full of passion than his dull cousin. Young Ladislaw did not pay that visit to which Mr. Brooke had invited him, and only 6 days afterwards Mr. Casaubon said that young Ladislaw had gone away to the continent once more. Chapter 4. Mr. Casaubon was trying to be more joyful about his marriage and to understand his young bride better, but he was fundamentally unsuited to this relationship and could not make himself more amenable to it. They decided to go to Rome on their honeymoon. Poor Mr. Casaubon had imagined that his long bachelorhood would make him enjoy the thought of marriage with Dorothea. He had been coming to Grange more often than ever. For their honeymoon he wished to inspect some manuscripts in the Vatican, and for this reason he was anxious. He said to Dorothea, "You'll have many lonely hours. I would feel more free if you had a companion. I have things to do there." For the first time his words made Dorothea color from annoyance. The words, "I would feel more free," grated on Dorothea. "You must have misunderstood me very much," she responded, "if you think I should not enter into the value of your time." "That's very kind of you, my dear Dorothea," said Mr. Casaubon. He didn't even notice that she was hurt. Afterwards, they attended a local dinner party, which her uncle had arranged. She was looking happy and beautiful. This was the last dinner party before their marriage. Mr. Brooke had invited their neighbors in the county, and also a number of people from the nearby town of Middlemarch. They were discussing their displeasure at Casaubon and Dorothea's marriage and the arrival of the new Dr. Lydgate. They said that the new doctor was from an old family in the north of England. He was handsome, young, and full of new ideas. Many of the townspeople proved completely pedestrian in their opinions, like good-looking, weak-willed women, and disapproving of any experimentation, especially related to medicine. "Dr. Lydgate has lots of quite new ideas," said Mr. Brooke to a group of Middlemarchers. These were people who liked tradition and routine, and would be hard for them to accept any progress or any outsiders in their community. "Do you think that sounds good?" asked another man. "Upsetting the old treatment which has made Englishmen what they are?" "Medical knowledge is our weakest point. It needs to be increased," said Mr. Bulstrode, the banker. "I hope to find good reason for confiding the new hospital to this management." Mr. Lydgate had quitted the party early, so he didn't hear this conversation. But before he went, he was introduced to Dorothea. He thought she was beautiful, a lady, but also too determined. He said to himself, "It is troublesome to talk to such women. They are always wanting reasons, yet they are too ignorant to understand the merits of any question." Evidently, Miss Brooke was not Mr. Lydgate's style of woman, and she was not again seen by this gentleman under her maiden name, for not long after that dinner party she became Mrs. Casaubon, and was on her way to Rome. Dr. Tertius Lydgate, the new doctor, was already enamored of Rosamond Vincy, the daughter of the Middlemarch's mayor. She was attractive, but the doctor was not economically ready for marriage. Lydgate believed that women should be quiet, obedient, and beautiful. Rosamond seemed determined to escape from the tangled web of Middlemarch marriages. Mr. Lydgate was an ideal man for her plans. The beautiful Rosamond had been sent to a good school, and had been taught to play piano and to have fine manners. Lydgate believed that he should not marry for several years until he would be a good husband economically. That day, at the Vincy's house, Rosamond was sewing. Mrs. Vincy was in the dining room and rang the bell for the maid, and said, "Knock at Mr. Fred's door again, and tell him it has struck 10:30. There wasn't any change in the happy good humor of Mrs. Vincy's face. No angles or lines had marked her beautiful face through 45 years. "Mother," said Rosamond, "I cannot bear the smell of fish all over the house at this hour of the morning. When Fred comes down, I wish you would not let him have red herrings." "Oh, my dear," answered Mrs. Vincy, "the only fault I find in you is that you are so hard on your brothers. But you never hear me speak in an unladylike way." "Don't deny your words, little lady," replied her mother, smiling. "Brothers are so unpleasant. Oh, Rosamond, you will be married some day, so it's better that you like young men." "I won't marry to anyone who is like Fred," cried Rosamond. "Don't talk so badly about your own brother, my dear. He seems to me the most clever. You are always finding fault with him." Fred Vincy was an aimless young man who had failed to get his degree at college, and seemed to do very little besides hanging about the house and bothering his sister. He often went to see his rich old uncle, Feathersome, who lived nearby at Stone Court, a big house in the country. His old uncle was generally ill. When Fred entered the room, Rosamond started to argue with him because it was very late for breakfast. "Have you got nothing else for breakfast, Pritchard?" said Fred to the servant who brought in coffee and buttered toast. "Would you like eggs, sir?" "Eggs? No. Bring me a grilled bone." "Fred," said Rosamond with an angry tone in her voice, "if you must have hot things for breakfast, I wish you would come down earlier. You can get up at 6 o'clock to go out hunting, so you can also come down earlier on other mornings." "I can get up to go hunting because I like it," replied Fred. "Come, Fred, tell us about the new doctor, Dr. Lydgate. Is your uncle pleased with him?" asked Mrs. Vincy. "He seems to be pleased with him, and last night I played cards with friends, and Dr. Lydgate was there too," said Fred, and continued, "They say he's of an excellent family. There was a Lydgate at Oxford University when I was there. He spent a lot of money. I find this man is a second cousin of his." Mrs. Vincey wanted his son to tell more about the doctor, so Fred started to describe him more. "Oh, tallish, dark-haired, talks well, and I think he is such a clever man. He is serious and interested in new medical knowledge. One can see that he likes to read." Suddenly Rosamond said, "I suppose Mary Garth admires Mr. Lydgate." "I can't say so," replied Fred, and he left the table discouraged. He liked Mary Garth. "If you are jealous of her, go oftener to Stone Court yourself," said Fred to her sister. "It's true what your brother says," Mrs. Vincey began, when the servant had cleared the table. "You should see your uncle more, as he is always asking of you. He does not separate Fred from you. He also wants you to live with him. You should at least have patience, and to go and see him more. God knows I'm fond of having you at home with me, but I can part with my children, for they are good." Rosamond planned to go over to Stone Court in the hope of seeing Dr. Lydgate. So she decided to join Fred, who was going to ride over the next day. Chapter 5. The next morning, Fred and Rosamond travelled to Stone Court, the house of their wealthy uncle, Mr. Featherstone. Mrs. Wall, their aunt, was also there, and she was trying to get even more money from her brother. His neighbours, who had called Peter Featherstone an old fox, had never accused him of being impolite. His sister was quite used to her brother's rude behaviours, and considered him as a respectable member of the family. Mr. Featherstone was lying on his bed in his bedroom. Before his cough was quiet, Rosamond entered, bearing up her riding habit. She smiled and said to Mary, "How do you do, miss?" Finally, her uncle noticed her. "You have a fine colour. Where's Fred?" "He will be here in a few minutes. He is seeing about the horses, uncle." After a short conversation, Fred came in, and Mr. Featherstone wanted the two ladies to go away. He wanted to talk to Fred alone. Mary and Rosamond talked about Fred while waiting to return to Mr. Featherstone's room. Mary told her that she liked Fred, but he was very unsteady. Meanwhile, Fred entered his uncle's room, and the old man began to speak angrily. "You've been paying 10% for the money you've borrowed, and the people say that you've told them that you'll have my land when I'm dead, but you know I can change my will still," his uncle said to Fred. He blushed and answered to his old and ill uncle, "I've never borrowed money on such an insecurity, uncle. Give me the name of the man who said that." Fred had spoken about the possibility of getting his uncle's land, but he had not borrowed money in that way. Finally, he realized that his aunt, Mrs. Wall, had told his uncle of this. Fred helped his uncle to walk around the room, and then Mr. Featherstone wanted the two ladies to join them. Mary Garth and Rosamond came back into the room. The old man wanted Rosamond to sing for him. When she was about to finish her song, Dr. Lydgate came in to see his patient. "I like her songs more than your medicine, doctor. You've nothing to say against that, eh, doctor?" Dr. Lydgate and Rosamond had finally met, and it seemed like their romance had already been destined to occur. "That has made me forget how time was going," said Rosamond, rising to reach her hat. "So, Miss Vincey is a musician?" asked Lydgate, examining her deeply with his eyes. "The best in Middlemarch," said her uncle. But Rosamond responded in a modest way. "You don't have to be very good in Middlemarch." She had taken off her hat to sing, so that her flower-like head on its white neck was seen in perfection above her riding habit. She bent her head, then their eyes met. "Fred, we really must go," said Rosamond. Lydgate turned a little paler, but Rosamond blushed deeply and was surprised with this scene. Yet she had planned everything about this meeting and this result called falling in love. She had meant him to fall in love with her. "Very good," replied Fred. "Let's go home. It's really late." Fred was sorry for the words that his uncle had said to him, so he wanted to leave the house as soon as he could. Rosamond was thinking about her wedding dress on the way back home. She couldn't get Dr. Lydgate out of her mind for a single minute. On the way back home, Fred wanted to talk to Rosamond. "Rosie, did Mary tell you that Mrs. Wall had said anything about me?" "Yes, she did." "What?" "That you were very unsteady." "Was that all?" "I think that was enough, Fred. You must be ashamed." "Ashamed of what?" "You care very much what Mary says, but you are so rude to me when I speak. That's all." Fred thought that his aunt had told Mary about borrowing money, but his suspicions were not confirmed. "Of course I care what Mary says. She's the best girl I know," he said. "I don't advise you to fall in love with her. She says she would not marry you if you asked her." She would not have said so if you had not provoked her. Fred was disappointed with the things Mary had said about him. Before reaching home, Fred decided to talk to his father about his feelings for Mary, and to ask for help concerning marriage. The following day, Fred visited his uncle again. Mr. Featherstone took out some notes and gave them to Fred. He said, "Your father won't leave you much. He may be the mayor of Middlemarch, but he won't have much to leave his family." He gave £100 to Fred, but this amount was not enough for his debt. Fred was grateful, but not as grateful as he could have been. Then Fred tried to talk to Mary Garth, whom he had feelings for, about his living and his feelings for her as well. But Mary was realistic about his prospects. "If I did love you, I wouldn't marry you. You're too lazy," said Mary. "I think you'd better pass your examination at the university. I can't accept a man who gets into debt and won't work." She knew that he could not marry until he would find a living and a stable income. Chapter 6. Dorothea was now Mrs. Casaubon, and was sitting in a fine room in an apartment in the Via Sistine in Rome. On their wedding journey, the Casaubons had been in Rome for 5 weeks. Her husband had spent most of his time studying, lost in the details, and Dorothea had visited all the famous historic places. She was completely alone in the apartment. She was so bored, but she didn't say anything to her husband. She had always considered him a very clever man, who was going to write a great book about ancient legends. But that morning, when she asked her husband a question, she realized for the first time that she had made a great mistake. "Won't you begin to write your book? I will be pleased to copy it for you," she said. She expected to help him as soon as she could, but the answer was cold and heartless. "Thank you, but you must leave it to me to decide when my book is ready." Mr. Casaubon's face went pink with anger. Dorothea realized that he would never write a book. She was crying secretly when she was alone. She couldn't understand how he became such a stone-hearted man. He continued his studyings during their honeymoon, and after that cold response, nothing was resolved. One afternoon, suddenly there was a knock on the door, and the servant said that there was a gentleman waiting to see Dorothea. This was Will Ladislaw, Mr. Casaubon's cousin, who came to visit them. "I didn't know you and Edward were in Rome until this morning. I saw you in the Vatican Museum," he said to Dorothea. Will was surprised to find that she was nice, friendly, and far better than his old cousin could ever deserve. Will's bad first impression was proven completely wrong. When Edward Casaubon came in, he was cold. Will and Dorothea discussed art, and she sensed that she had found a valuable friend. Mr. Casaubon was not pleased by his cousin's presence. Nevertheless, he invited Will to dinner with them the next day. Mr. Casaubon knew that they had a blood relationship, and he didn't want his wife to think that he was so rude to his relatives. In fact, he was jealous of his cousin, and did not want her to see him again, but he never revealed his true feelings to anyone. Will Ladislaw was delightfully agreeable at dinner the next day. He impressed Dorothea with the way he was able to listen to Casaubon and make him feel at ease. But Will visited Dorothea another day, when Casaubon was not at home. They spoke for a long time, and Will told her plainly that she would not be happy with Casaubon, and that her piety was completely unnatural. Finally, they had returned to Lowick Manor from their wedding journey. Dorothea, who had been so dejected during their honeymoon, felt revived by being home in familiar surroundings. Mr. Brooke and Celia came over to visit the couple. "How lovely to see you back again," said Celia, kissing her sister. They cried secretly. "It's very pleasant to have you back again, but Casaubon is a little pale," said Mr. Brooke. "Studying hard on his honeymoon must have made him so, but there's nothing to worry you, my dear Dorothea." Then Dorothea went up to her sitting room. Celia was waiting for her. "Do you think Rome is a suitable place for a honeymoon?" asked Celia. "It wouldn't suit everyone. You would find it boring, but I liked it," answered Dorothea, and added, "Celia, you've got news for me, Uncle says." "Yes," said Celia, and continued, "I've promised to marry Sir James." This was not a big surprise for Dorothea. She was happy for her sister. "Celia, I do believe you couldn't marry better. He is a good man," she said warmly. But even Celia knew that Dorothea was Sir James' great love. Chapter 7. Mr. Casaubon's beliefs about marriage were reiterated. He had wanted to marry someone young and impressionable so that she would be pleasant and able to help him with his work. But now he was not happy. He knew he had to write his great work on the key to all legend, but he was deep in detail, and he could not know how to continue with it. One morning, Mr. Casaubon handed her a letter. It was a letter coming from Will Ladislaw, suggesting a visit to them. But Mr. Casaubon said coldly to Dorothea, "I must refuse to have him here. I wish to have a little freedom to work. I don't want guests whose liveliness makes their presence too tiring." Dorothea blushed with anger, but she didn't argue with him on this matter. While Dorothea was reading the letter, suddenly she heard the loud bang of a book on the floor. She saw Mr. Casaubon on the steps by the books, and he was leaning forward as if he was ill. The servant came, and he was helped to bed. They called Dr. Lydgate. Dr. Lydgate checked on Casaubon, but he couldn't find anything immediately wrong. He asked that Casaubon give up his studies for the time being and focus on leisurely pursuits. But he had much more to inform Dorothea about the condition of her husband. "He might live for 15 years or more, but it's not certain," he said. "You mean, if we are very careful?" replied Dorothea. Lydgate said that he must be kept away from any stress, and he added, "I don't advise telling him the situation." Dorothea turned very white. She was so sad, but she was not sure exactly what to think. "I thank you for telling me the truth," said Dorothea. Will Ladislaw was supposed to be arriving there in a few days, so she asked Mr. Brooke to write him a letter saying that Casaubon was ill and not to visit him. Mr. Brooke did write a letter, but the contents were like nothing Dorothea had wanted. Mr. Brooke invited Ladislaw, and also proposed that he might work for him. He wanted Will to write speeches and letters for him. Chapter 8. Mr. Peter Featherstone was ill too. He was too old, and nearly all of his relatives were at his big house, visiting him one by one, hoping he would remember them in his will. They were like vultures circling, waiting to pick up his money, although they had done nothing for him. Mr. Featherstone did not want to see any of the greedy, crowding relatives, so Mary Garth, his nurse, had to try and turn them away. One night, Mary was on nursing duty, and she was awake in case he would wake up and want anything. Then, at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, she heard his clear voice saying, "Missy, come here." He was holding a key, and then he unlocked a box, taking from it another key. "Now do as I tell you," said Mr. Featherstone to Mary. "This is the key of my iron box in the cupboard over there. Turn the lock with this key, and you'll see the paper has the words 'Last Will' on it." Mary refused to do what he asked for. "I won't touch your key, sir. Please don't ask me to do it again, or I'll call your brother Jonah." "Not do it? You must do it. Take the key. These are my last 2 wills," said the old man. "No, sir," Mary insisted. So Mr. Featherstone took notes and gold coins out of the box he held in his hand. "Take these. You shall have them." Mary's eyes filled with fear. "I won't touch your money, sir," she replied. "Wait till morning, sir. Let me prepare you a drink." The old man tried to hit her with his stick, but she moved back. She sat down by the fire for a while. Then Mary noticed the old man was lying quietly. His face looked motionless. She listened for his breathing, but suddenly she ran to the bell and rang it. She noticed that the old man was dead. The next day he was buried in Lowick churchyard. All his relatives were waiting to hear the last will of the rich Mr. Featherstone. Among them was a man about 33. His name was Joshua Rigg. Other relatives thought that he would be a love child of Mr. Featherstone's. Finally, the lawyer came in and started to read his last will. "The will I hold in my hand was drawn up by myself and executed by our deceased friend on the 9th of August, 1825. But I've found out that there is a second will, signed by him on 20th July, 1826. I shall begin by reading the earlier will," said the lawyer. In the first will, Mr. Featherstone had left small amounts of money to most of his relatives, and he had left Fred Vincey £10,000. The Vinceys were pleased to hear this, but when the second will was announced, they were all surprised except Mr. Joshua Rigg. Nobody present got any money at all, and he had left the house and a lot of land to this stranger, named Joshua Rigg. Fred looked pale. Mary didn't dare look at him. When they were all leaving the hall, Mary met him and said, "I believe you're better without money. Be brave, Fred." "And you have not even £100 left. What shall you do now, Mary?" asked Fred. "I'll take another job, of course, as soon as I can get one," she replied. Stone Court was cleared of all the disappointed Featherstones in a very short time. Chapter 9. Mr. Vincey had wanted Rosamond to postpone her marriage. Dr. Tertius Lydgate was 27, serious-minded, and determined to work for the building of a new hospital in Middlemarch. He didn't have any wedding plans, but when he saw Rosamond, he was so attracted by her beauty that he asked her to marry him. But the doctor was still a poor man. Rosamond talked to her father and told him that she was really in love with Lydgate. Finally, Mr. Vincey agreed on the date of the wedding. Dr. Lydgate spent a lot of money on furnishing the house for his bride. We had said that Mr. Casaubon hadn't wanted his cousin at home, but Mr. Brooke had invited him to the Grange and asked him to work for him. So Ladislaw came to town. One day in Middlemarch, Ladislaw met Dorothea, and their friendship grew. On a rainy day, Will was again near to Lowick, and he was pleased to find Dorothea alone at home. They began to speak as they had done in Rome, very happy to be alone in each other's company. Casaubon was not suspicious that Dorothea was being influenced by Will, but he thought that that would happen. He started to dislike his cousin more than ever. As soon as Dr. Lydgate came back from his honeymoon with Rosamond, he immediately called to Mr. Casaubon, whose health seemed to be getting worse. The old man started to admit that he had failed in his lifelong project. He began to feel worried about his health. When Dr. Lydgate came, he told Casaubon that he had a weak heart. He might live another 15 years, but he might also die suddenly. The next morning, Mr. Casaubon had not been very well, so he rested the whole day. At night, Mr. Casaubon asked Dorothea, "If I die, will you do what I wish?" "I cannot promise till I know what it is. Let me have time till tomorrow," she answered. Dorothea could not sleep that night. But in the morning, when she went to the garden, she saw her husband resting on the table, and his head bent down. She realized that Mr. Casaubon, the man who she most admired, was dead. Chapter 10. Dorothea could not feel well after the sudden death of her husband. She was taken to the Tipton Grange, to her uncle's house. She tried to be happy with Mr. Brooke, Sir James, Celia, and their baby son, but she was wondering what his last will was. Finally, Celia told her sister about this will. "He left all of his properties to you, but Mr. Casaubon added something to his will. The property is not to come to you if you marry," said Celia. "This doesn't matter," said Dorothy. But Celia declared the main condition of this will. "But you are to lose the property if you marry Mr. Ladislaw. No one else," Celia said, and continued, "Of course you would never marry him." Dorothea had turned cold, but the blood rushed painfully to her face. She found out that her husband had secret thoughts. He had been suspicious of everything his wife said and did. Suddenly she felt a strange feeling in her heart. She had never thought that Mr. Ladislaw could be in love with her until that moment. Will Ladislaw was helping Mr. Brooke in his work in politics in Middlemarch. The time for the new election for the Parliament had come. Mr. Brooke wished to stand for election as a member of Parliament. His views were progressive, but he couldn't put his thoughts into a convincing argument, and he did very badly at meetings. So things were thrown at him. Mr. Brooke had to give up the idea of becoming a member of Parliament. This also meant the end of Will's job. Will also didn't have any idea about Mr. Casaubon's last will. "I'll write you any letters you need to show people," said Mr. Brooke. Then Will thought, "The rest of the family will try to persuade him to get rid of me, but I shall stay here as long as I like. I'll go when I choose, and not because they are afraid of me." So he stayed in Middlemarch, to be near Dorothea. He was thinking of his future. He would become a political writer, raise himself up, if he knew Dorothea would marry him after he achieved these things. Dorothea had gone back to Lowick Manor to live in that big house. She was questioning the 18 months of her married life. But, in fact, she was deep longing to see Will Ladislaw again. She did not even know if he was still in Middlemarch. Perhaps Will had heard about his cousin's last will and thought they should not meet again. But one morning, Will visited her to see if she had some affection to encourage him with. They were both frustrated by not being able to admit their affection. "I plan to go to London and become a lawyer, and then I shall go into politics," said Will. "And you have so many gifts," replied Dorothea warmly. "When we were in Rome I thought you only cared about poetry and art, but now I know you think about the rest of the world and want to help matters." "You will forget me," said Will. "No, I'll never forget you," she replied, smiling. The blood rose to the face of Will, as there was a strong feeling in him. But for Will it wasn't fair to marry a rich woman and live on her money. He didn't know that she would lose it if she married him. Their conversation was interrupted by the servant. He said that Sir James was waiting to see Dorothea, so Will Ladislaw said goodbye to her and left the Lowick Manor. Chapter 11. Dr. Tertius Lydgate and his beautiful wife Rosamond were living in their big house with their expensive furniture. One day they got a visit from his cousin, Captain Lydgate. Rosamond was delighted by his visit because she liked to be seen with her husband's relatives. Dr. Lydgate didn't like his cousin's behavior, and he wanted him to leave. Rosamond got upset with her husband. The captain had offered her to ride on a grey horse. Tertius did not think this wise, because there would always be a chance of an accident. Rosamond was expecting a baby, but soon Tertius realized he had little power over her. Rosamond rode the new grey horse, and while she was riding out, she had a bad fall, which led finally to the loss of the baby. Captain Lydgate left the house soon after this accident. Tertius could only say, "Poor, poor darling." He was full of anger, but he did not show this to his wife. Rosamond was ill, but soon she recovered, and Tertius told her about the large debt he owed to the shopkeepers. He had bought expensive furniture to make her happy, but as he was not earning enough to pay for them, this was a big problem for both of them. "What can I do?" said Rosamond, coloring deeply. "Have you asked Papa for money?" "No," said Tertius. "It's too late. Some men will have to come tomorrow and make a list of the furniture." This would act as a security for the money he owed. He tried to speak to Rosamond about keeping expenses down and buying less expensive things, but he was too soft-hearted to really tell her anything. But Rosamond was thinking to herself that she would not have married Lydgate if she had known he was to have little money. Tertius realized that he would always have to struggle to keep her from wasting too much money. Finally, Will Ladislaw had said goodbye to Dorothea, but we must say that he delayed his departure from Middlemarch. One day, Will visited Rosamond, and she told him of the condition of Mr. Casaubon's last will. He was astonished, but he did not want to leave without seeing Dorothea again. A few days later, Will met a man called John Raffles. "Excuse me, Mr. Ladislaw, what was your mother's name?" "Sarah Dunkirk?" he asked. "Yes, sir," said Will. "And what's it to you?" The man told him that he knew his mother when she was a young girl. He also told Will that his mother had run away from her family because her family was dishonest. Later, he said that she had been married to his grandmother, and that he had become rich from that marriage. Although Mr. Raffles offered a great deal of money to Will as a pay of debt, he refused this offer, saying, "Keep your dishonest money away." It seemed as if Mr. Raffles had undesirable stories to tell about Will's family. This gave Will even more of a reason to leave. Before stories like these could besmirch his name even more. Mr. Raffles also had dark stories about Mr. Bulstrode's past, who was the banker of Middlemarch. For this reason, Bulstrode was trying to keep him away from his family. Chapter 12. Bulstrode was making plans for giving up his work in Middlemarch and going away to the seaside to live. He was afraid of Mr. Raffles. One day Mary Garth's father, Caleb, visited Mr. Bulstrode. He said he had seen a strange man on the road, and he was so ill. He told Bulstrode that this man needed a doctor. This ill man's name was Raffles. Bulstrode was shocked with the news, and immediately called Dr. Lydgate to examine Mr. Raffles. He had the fear that Raffles might have told about his unpleasant past to Caleb Garth. He was right. "He said you led a dishonest life, and kept others from their rights by a trick," said Mr. Garth, promising not to tell this dark secret to anybody else. The last time Dr. Lydgate talked to Mr. Bulstrode, he had been refused help in his debts, and now the furniture was about to be taken for his debts. When the doctor came to examine the patient, Bulstrode changed his mind and wrote a check for £1,000 to Lydgate. The doctor felt totally relaxed and thanked the banker. Lydgate would never take money from another man, but now he was pleased. He thought of how his life had changed since he had married in Middlemarch. Mr. Bulstrode was afraid that Raffles would tell the doctor the unpleasant stories about him, so he felt better giving the doctor the money he needed. Dr. Lydgate gave him directions about the treatments of Raffles and left. The doctor knew that Raffles had alcoholic poisoning, so he allowed some opium to reduce the deep veins, but no alcohol. The next day Lydgate reduced the amount of opium. But that night, while Mrs. Abel, the housekeeper, was looking after Raffles, she asked Mr. Bulstrode to give the patient some alcohol and more opium. This time the banker gave the key of the cupboard where whiskey was kept. The next morning, Bulstrode heard a very heavy breathing coming from Raffles' room. He hid the whiskey bottle and the empty opium bottle. Dr. Lydgate arrived at 10:30. He found out that Raffles was already dead. He had not expected the man to die, but he couldn't ask questions to Bulstrode. He kept his questions to himself. Chapter 13. Bulstrode didn't know that a few days before Raffles' death, Mr. Bambridge, a horse dealer, had met Raffles in a horse fair, and he had heard something about Bulstrode's past life. Bambridge had repeated the stories of himself in the town, so people began to say bad things about Bulstrode. They were accusing him of Raffles' death. They also suspected that the money with which Dr. Lydgate had paid his debts had come from Bulstrode. They thought that Bulstrode had given money to silence him. Dorothea had just returned from a visit to the north of England. Mr. Brooke went to see her and told her the stories about Bulstrode and Lydgate. Dorothea listened to her uncle silently, and at last said, "You don't believe that Dr. Lydgate is guilty of anything wrong, do you?" she said. She was determined to find out the truth and clear him. Lydgate had not told Rosamond about the story, because he knew he could expect neither sympathy nor understanding, but soon she learned the truth. She only said, "I cannot go on living here. Let's go to London." There was no sympathy in her words, but Lydgate refused to leave the town, as if he was running away from the untrue stories. A few days later, Dorothea went to talk to Dr. Lydgate, and learned the true story from him. Lydgate, trusting in her, told her what had happened. She was the only person who believed that he was not guilty. She wrote a check to pay his debt to Bulstrode, and told him that she wanted to talk with Rosamond about the truth. She also promised to give support to him on the arrangements for the new hospital. The next day, Dorothea went to Lydgate's house to see Rosamond. The young servant showed Dorothea to the sitting room to wait. She could hear voices. Rosamond was there with Will Ladislaw. She was crying, and Will was holding her hands. This scene upset Dorothea, and seemed to be the proof that Will loved Rosamond, and not her. So she rushed out. Will and Rosamond were shocked at being found in a way that would look bad to Dorothea. Will was very angry with Rosamond, and he blamed her for upsetting Dorothea. Chapter 14. Dorothea spent a sleepless night, but in the light of the morning she realized that she had not yet talked to Rosamond as she had promised to Lydgate that she would. She also felt ashamed of her jealousy, so she went once again to the Lydgates' house. The couple thanked her for the check, and Dorothea started to talk to Rosamond alone in the room. She assured Rosamond that her husband was a good person, and was still welcomed in Middlemarch by people of character and influence like herself, Sir James and Mr. Brooke. "Lydgate loves you best. The worst loss would be to lose that," said Dorothea to her, "and you haven't lost it." Dorothea was so kind and sympathetic that Rosamond was deeply touched, so she explained the scene with Will Ladislaw that she had seen the previous day. Rosamond said, "You are thinking what isn't true. He had been listening to our family troubles. He was also telling me how much he loved you, but now he hates me, because you misunderstood what you saw yesterday." Dorothea felt a joyful feeling deep inside, and she left the Lydgates' house after this conversation with Rosamond. After Dorothea went, Rosamond and Tertius started to talk warmly, and he asked, "Has she made you any less dissatisfied with me?" She answered softly, "I think she has," looking up in his eyes and holding his hands. Will Ladislaw was debating with himself whether he should leave Middlemarch after the events of the previous day. Finally, he decided to visit Dorothea after talking to Rosamond. She had told Ladislaw about Dorothea's visit, but Rosamond's words couldn't make him all glad, because he was wondering if things ever could be the same between him and Dorothea. When Will went to see her again, Dorothea was standing in the middle of a large library. The sky was grey outside, and it was about to rain. The storm was coming. Will came towards her, but Dorothea did not give her hand to greet him as usual. "I wanted to see you," said Dorothea. "You know the painful story about my parents, how my mother ran away from my home and lived in poverty," said Will. Dorothea said that she knew all about his story. They stood together while the thunder gave a great crack and roll above them. The rain began to pour down. He came towards her, took her hand and raised it to his lips. "There is no hope for me," said Will. "I will most likely always be poor. I couldn't offer myself to any woman, even if she had no riches to give up." There was a great silence between them. Will tried to say goodbye, but he was affected by passion. He said they could not be together, yet it was a cruel thing. Dorothea decided that she could not let him go again. She would rather give up the wealth that Casaubon had left her and go with Will, with the aid of her own fortune to support them. "Oh, my heart will break. I don't know about poverty, but I hate my wealth," she said. Will got close to her and put his arms around her softly. Her large eyes were full of tears. Chapter 15. A few days later, Dorothea's family knew that she was going to marry Will Ladislaw. Sir James objected strongly to this marriage. He was very angry, and he wanted to protect Dorothea as he should have protected her from the marriage with Casaubon, though this time she did not need help. Everyone still had a great deal of prejudice against Will, and much concern for Dorothea. Meanwhile, Bulstrode was getting ready to leave Middlemarch, since he could not bear the shame of being there any longer. Finally, with his wife, they wanted to do a good thing, and so they decided to give the management of Stone Court to Fred, Rosamond's brother, and a decent income, so that he might be able to save some money. Mary Garth was very happy with Fred's occupation, and soon they got engaged. Mary and Fred lived happily ever after. Fred bought Stone Court, and they had 3 boys. Lydgate and Rosamond were also happy together. Lydgate was able to make a successful practice. Dorothea and Will also married soon after, and they were happy together. Will went into politics and became a member of Parliament. They had a boy. Sir James allowed Cecilia to see her sister. Will and Dorothea made visits twice a year to Mr. Brooke's house. Dorothea was not able to make the big impact she desired, but she was able to have a wonderful family and give happiness to the ones who surrounded her.